I've been developing software in small teams for over a decade with Neon Tribe. We work with nonprofits to build digital tools that complement their overstretched services. I've also been raising children for a quarter of a century, and I've dabbled in the film industry. And over this time, I've noticed about how people work together and how they behave in groups and how they treat each other. And I've been involved with projects where they break down because of a lack of communication. So I'm going to share some practical tips and talk about how and why I think Elm helps make happier and more productive teams. And much of my talk is probably things that you already know, but I think it's important to give teams and people the confidence to make a be nice atmosphere. And maybe I'll say something that you didn't know too. But anyway, if you know all this stuff already, hopefully I'll make you feel good about what you're already doing. So usually our projects at Neon Tribe have a lead front-end developer and a lead back-end developer, and I was a back-end lead. About 2 years ago, I got assigned to lead a project, and they only had enough budget for one lead developer. And after the discovery, it turned out there was no back-end. So with our other projects, I'd been down the jQuery, Handlebars, Angular, Vue route, and I was really suspicious of JavaScript. Well, that's not fair. I wasn't suspicious of JavaScript. I was suspicious of my ability to write good JavaScript. And I was totally not confident that I wouldn't make a mess without a front-end lead to help me. So at the same time, I was playing with Clojure and Haskell, and I was feeling like functional was a really safe, predictable space. And then someone mentioned Elm. So the app that I was building was basically a tool that uses stories and illustrations and some bite-sized information to help victims of domestic violence gain the confidence to get in touch for help. And it was essentially a really simple structure. So we built it over a year in short iterations, and we had our ups and downs. We had a lot of conversations in my company with other senior developers about Elm being the wrong tool, and it was over-engineered. And ironically, the experienced developers had a lot more trouble reading the Elm than the beginners. They found the syntax really confusing. And I think it's because when you're used to reading a language, you can look at like a whole block of code and just understand what it's doing without having to think about it. You don't have to like manually pass through it. And a few of the languages that they've been working in, they're all structured in a similar way. And there's a really superficial, as we all know, difference in the way that Elm is laid out. And so they looked at it and they immediately just went, I'm not going to look at that. So that made me reflect that we need to learn to trust each other's tech and each other's knowledge and our ability to evaluate and make choices in good faith. And I tried to explain to my colleagues that yes, Elm can make more complex apps safer, but it's also a really solid foundation for any UI. Unfortunately, not everyone in my company agreed with me, but we shipped the product and everyone mostly forgot about it. A year later, we got a phone call from the women's charity who we'd made the app for, and they'd had really good feedback from a lot of women. And so what they wanted to do was translate the app into a couple more languages to see if they could reach more people in their area. And around the same time, we got a call from the funding body who had funded that charity to make the app, and they were so happy with the success of the app that they wanted us to white label the format and roll it out to like 3 or 4 more charities to see if it would help them as well. So I spoke to my manager about it, and we decided that between myself and the original developer who was supportive of Elm, we decided that between us, we could handle doing the upgrade to 19 and the translations. But we definitely wouldn't be able to have time to roll out the clones because we had like maybe 2 or 3 days a month available for the whole period that we had to deliver it. So what he decided was that we should probably port the original format into HTML and JavaScript so that other people could work on it. And my manager was thinking in terms of like labels of the people that he had available. But precisely because the project was in Elm, I had a hunch that I'd be able to rely on people in my team who didn't yet identify themselves as coders. So when Holly, who'd been with us for 3 months, stepped forward after stand-up asking if anyone needed help with anything, I said, yes, there is something I need help with. So historically, Neon Tribe is a bunch of developers, all from different backgrounds. Some people changed careers, some people had computer science degrees, some people had just been self-taught. And between us, we took care of all the non-development work. But recently, we hired a few people with little to no coding experience to support us with those tasks. And those new hires, they had a bit more time on their hands because they weren't like deep in the company already. So we set off with myself and the other developer who'd worked originally on the app, who, like I said before, only had like 2 or 3 days out of a whole month available, a user researcher with a maths degree who'd done a bit of coding and had loads of experience in the charity sector, so she was going to lead the discovery sessions with the new charities and liaise with the clients. And of course we had Holly, the recent arts graduate that I mentioned, who was our new illustrator who really wanted to help. So of course we hit all the same problems that every software project has. It didn't go swimmingly by any stretch, but this is what worked well and how Holly helped me reflect on where our process could be better. So now that we had Holly on board, I wanted to come up with a kind of common sense framework, some guidelines so that we could help her do the project without us being available. So the first thing we decided was that we need to keep minimal what new team members need to know. You don't need to teach them all the intricacies of Git or how powerful the type system is in Elm or anything. You just need to show them the tiny bit of code that they're going to be working on to begin with, and they can build their way out of that. You need to have short conversations with them often. So even though we were really busy, we could find 5 minutes every day or 10 minutes twice a week or half an hour at the end of the week to kind of check in with Holly and see how she was getting on, or for doing bits of code review in between. And this is another really important one that we didn't actually get around to doing, but I think it's a really good idea. And I can't say for your situation, but I think it's really important to set guidelines for code review, because that was one of the things that we had trouble with new people to coding. There's a few talks that could help you design this format. One of them is Richard Feldman's talk in last year, elm-conf, where he talked about some changes to the model. Could they be introducing duplication? And that would be a really simple thing to check through for somebody who didn't understand the whole thing. Another one is Ali Kelly McKnight's talk about naming conventions in Elm. And again, that would be a really simple reference for them to just check. And Seiya Izumi did a talk in Elm Europe where he was talking about onboarding the biggest Elm app in Japan. And they actually, this is where I got the idea from, they actually had a matrix that said, if you're reviewing the model, look for these types of things. If you're reviewing a view, look for these types of things. And the last thing that I think is really important is to talk to each other about how to pronounce the code. I saw a really good talk by Felina Hermans, who's doing the keynote tomorrow at Strange Loop, and that was called How Code Sounds. And it was about, she's been teaching children how to code, and it was about how if you don't know how to pronounce a symbol or something that you come across in something that you're reading, it really stops your brain from being able to process anything else. You probably had the experience of you're reading a novel and you come across a name that you don't know how to pronounce. What I do is I just pronounce it in some random way in my head, and I stick to that through the whole novel. But it usually has no phonetical relationship to the actual word. And I think the same thing can happen when you're reading code, but you have to get past it. And it sounds stupid, but something simple like a dash could be a hyphen, or it can be contextual sometimes, so it might be minus. And you just need to discuss, even before you get into curly braces and square brackets and round, it's very confusing when you're trying to talk to people about it. So just like organizations and projects and teams need new people with fresh perspectives, our communities need new people with fresh perspectives too. And I'm really proud to be a member of the London Elm Code Meetup, because Mario does a really great job of welcoming newcomers, and he always tailors the content to whichever people turn up. In fact, the invitation is so open and welcoming that people who don't even know what Elm is, but they want to get into coding or get back into coding from having a break 20 years ago, and they turn up, and we like that, and we help them. So when Holly first joined the project, she didn't have a development environment set up, and I didn't think that should be a barrier. So I even got our testing manager to submit directly to GitHub, because I was kind of on a roll. I was trying to get as many people as possible to submit something. And so what he did is he went to the GitHub interface online and just pressed new file, and then he copy-pasted an issue template from another one of our repositories and named it bug MD, and got really excited because he made a thing that he could see. So often first issues are about editing copy or making some sort of trivial change. And anyway, even if they're not, we're editing plain text files. So to think that you need this whole massive setup just to contribute a little bit is not right. So with Elm, new developers and non-developers can be productive really quickly. And the framework doesn't get in the way. It's really easy to set up. There's no massive boilerplate for them to navigate around or be scared of. There's no complicated tool chain to understand. And this sort of reminded me of something my colleague said recently, which was he thought it was a real shame that like younger programmers and new programmers could no longer do things like configuring a postfix server. And I was like, surely that's a good thing that they no longer need to worry about configuring a postfix server. And it just made me think how great it is that we no longer need to know how to write safe JavaScript in order to be good at our jobs. So once Holly was all set up, she started submitting more than just copy changes. And I remembered a time when another colleague had been coding for about a year. He'd been with us for about a year, and he wasn't really writing code before he came to us. And one day he said, it seems like all we do every day is go around in circles rewriting each other's code in our own style. And I kind of looked at what had been happening to him, and he was right. He'd been writing a feature and with some CSS and getting it through review and merging it into the release, and then a week later, someone else would write another feature that was like in the same area, and they didn't quite like agree with his style of CSS, and so they would write his CSS again in their style and add their own bit with their own CSS. And it kind of turned out that like on a sort of 3-week cycle, everything that the one developer was writing, the other one was rewriting it at the same time as they were doing their new work. And there wasn't really any reason for it. So sometimes these kind of refactors are really important, and sometimes they aren't. So as with everything I'm saying, the most important thing is to consider what you're doing and why you're doing it in the context of your own circumstance. So because of that experience with that developer, I was really careful to let Holly do it her way and not tidy up after her if it wasn't a critical thing. Collaboration means that everything shouldn't be in your own style, and you should let the project style evolve with everyone having input. So I mentioned code review guidelines earlier, and that's because when Holly first started contributing to code review, she didn't say much. And I think that's a common experience. People are scared to like let other people know maybe what they don't know, what they're ignorant about or what they don't understand. So I talked to Holly a lot about not being afraid to write more than like, hey, that looks good, in her code reviews, and just observe things and make comments about them. And she got a lot more confident in her responses. So for us, and like for experienced developers as well, sometimes you will come across code that you don't understand. And you shouldn't just rewrite it, which is what some people do, and you shouldn't ignore it. You should ask about it and have a conversation with the person who wrote it, if you can, if they're still in your company or still around. I like this conversation that Holly had with that user researcher that I mentioned earlier. You probably can't see it, so I'll read it to you. I can't see it very well either. It says, it seems to have added a double quote instead of a single quote. I don't know if that's important. Oh, it's just my prettifier trying to make things pretty. It's not any proper changes. Thumbs up. Ah, that makes sense. In some cases, it's made things less pretty, but apart from that, it looks good. I know, it's really odd. And there was, after that, another comment from another developer explaining the whole situation. But I thought that was great, that those kind of conversations are just happening in our code bases. So the declarative style of Elm allows people to discover their own how. There are many routes to get to the same endpoint. And if you give everyone ownership of their own journey and don't instruct them on how to do things, you just give them a framework that guides them, they will be happier. So when Holly comes back to this code base in 6 months, she'll appreciate that she had a hand in these decisions and that she was allowed to wander around a little bit. We don't often take the perfect path the first time round, nor do we often or ever, probably, take decisions without thinking about them. And my colleague Rupert sums this up really nicely in that you must have faith in your colleagues' competence and their good intentions. It's very likely that the problem you perceive is an indication of trade-offs that you don't yet understand. So you can have a lot of people in your team because more people in the team means there's less burden on the individual, and that's great. You can have people who are outside your core team who are there for bouncing ideas off of, and they can occasionally jump in when deadlines are looming. But you need to remember, especially if you're one of those people who's outside the core team, that sometimes things get made like a long time ago before something existed or before a certain tool chain was in place. And sometimes things get made in a hurry. And sometimes things like people make mistakes also, but there's always a story. So it's really important to remember that when you're looking at code that other people have written. So I had a really valuable learning experience with a colleague from that original Elm project. And because it was about people or for people who were in like violent or abusive relationships. We had a safety feature that was a timeout. If you'd gone idle for more than a certain amount of time, the app would just turn off and go to Google. And in order to implement this, like obviously this was my first Elm app, and I was like super scared of like time and Elm. And so in order to implement it, I just made like a sleep timer, and I just kicked off multiple sleep timers all the time, and they all had IDs, and then I was like kept track of which was the most recent one, and when any of them reached the time limit, I checked if it was the most recent one, and then we kicked off the timeout function. And it was really complicated, and it was like the only part of the app that was really buggy. And my colleague, who at that time had only been with us for a month, see the pattern here, I just take people who come new and I bring them over to Elm. He'd been with us for a month. He was a game developer, and he was moving into web development. So he had no JavaScript experience, and he wasn't very confident. And he said, you know, this like seems really complicated. If I was doing this in C#, I would do it like this. And it was like really simple. And I just immediately said, oh, you can't do that now. And of course, I didn't even know whether you could do it in Elm or not. So because of that, then what happened was, I went to Elm Europe last year, so this is a year on, and there were loads of talks about game development in Elm. And around the third or fourth talk where people were saying, what you do is you make a subscription to time, and you have a tick in your model, and you keep track of it, and then you can sync it. And I was like, wait a minute, that's what my colleague was trying to tell me a year ago. And I came back home and I got really excited. I implemented it. It was super simple, no bugs. And you probably can't read my comment. This is like me being really excited in a commit. So much better timeout function, exclamation mark. That's how excited I get, I guess. So because of that, I'm not so quick to dismiss the thoughts of newcomers to the project, no matter what their experience. And I think that we need to remember that everyone's voice is valid. And sometimes with less knowledge, we can point out a much simpler way. So especially if you're looking at a really small part of a big picture in a collaboration, sometimes like more overview and more like the more entrenched you are in something, it makes it seem much more complicated than it needs to be. So those people who have those new ideas, they might only say them to you once, and they'll probably say them like really, really quietly. So you need to listen out. It's important to remember to trust your team, and by that I mean trust everyone in your team, no matter what you think their knowledge is. So remember that picture of my team? If we'd stuck to thinking of Holly as an illustrator, we probably wouldn't have been able to deliver the project on time. Because if you label something as X, then people will be lazy about assigning value or use cases to it. But if you don't label something, people can use their own experience and imagination and intuition to assess the capability of that person or that thing within the context that you're in. And sometimes our job titles can erode or inflate our self-esteem as well. One thing that we had success with recently on a project was to try and remove some of the vocabulary from people's job titles that was diminishing their identity. And job titles like junior or trainee, which in my company were being assigned to people who were like 35, 40 years old, they're there because the accounts department needs to justify charging more for a more senior person and less for a less senior person. But I think that if your company is on board with this idea, then you should be able to get rid of those labels. You should be able to get everyone into a position where words like trainee and junior no longer apply, like within months of them joining your project or joining your company. They can just be developers. You can have loads of developers, right? So one thing that we like to do in this industry as well is like call people rockstar developers or JavaScript ninjas or other terms which are maybe more derogatory that some people are proud of, like being a server gnome. You can see those ones in my picture. I just want to focus on the rockstar one, or that kind of concept, and because it is a real concept that somebody can have a lot of knowledge or a lot of experience. You can be a veteran who's like learned stuff over time, right? You can learn like tiny bits of knowledge bit by bit that you never forget. And like an example of that would be a concept in English grammar, which is a numerum, which we work with a lot or we come across in our industry. And some people don't even know what it is. And basically is if you have like a really, really long word, you can drop all the letters out from the middle of it and count them up, and then you stick that number back into the middle of the word, and you get something like A11Y for accessibility or I18N for internationalization. And there are loads of people like accessibility experts who don't know that. And they're just saying Ali, but they don't know what it means. And so it's just really important to like remember that nobody knows everything. And there's another type of like knowledge or skill that people can have that's just a natural skill. So some things come much easier to some people than other people. And again, I've got a really good story about that for me, my personal experience, where I was at a conference and I met somebody who I thought one of my friends should meet. And so I went back to my friend and I said, oh, I've met this man, I think you should meet him because he's got like similar interests. And the problem was that I'm really bad at recognizing faces. I even like can't recognize my own children sometimes, which sounds silly, but it's true. I was explaining to my friend, he's wearing a black t-shirt and we were at a tech conference, so that obviously didn't help. And he's kind of got a haircut like this guy or that guy, you know. And so I was saying, you got to help me try and look out for him. And someone was kind of like halfway in the conversation, was overhearing it. And he just like piped up really loud and he said, oh my gosh, that's really stupid. Even a female baby can recognize faces. That's like scientifically proven. And I'm not sure if he was trying to say that I wasn't a female or that I was like stupider than a baby, but either way, it wasn't a really helpful thing to say. So just in the same way that you should respect like people's knowledge or lack of it, you should respect people's natural abilities to do things. And labels can be put there by yourself or they can be put there by others. So I think that someone who's like self-labeling themselves as a rock star, that probably means they don't realize the like expanse of the domain that they're in. There's like a really famous saying about like, you don't know what you don't know. That's probably someone who calls themselves a rock star. If your boss says that you're a rock star, if he introduces you to a client as like, oh, you're really lucky you've got like a rock star developer, that puts like a huge amount of pressure on you to cover up your gaps in knowledge or to keep up the appearance of having a deep knowledge. And like honestly, every project we work on, you're learning new things all the time. You never really know what is going to come up in the project that you're working on. So it's really unfair to put that pressure on your colleagues or people. So I'm really guilty of that with Holly because she did the illustrations of the slide of our team. And I was like, oh, can you just make a slide that has like some people who are like just going about their jobs, they're not happy, they're not sad, and then like, can you make another one where everyone's like a little bit angry or a little bit sad, and then another one for the end where everyone's like really happy. And she sort of went, well, I could try, but I'm really bad at doing people's faces. And I just made the assumption that she was an illustrator, she could like draw anything, right? But of course that's not true, the same way that like someone who writes code can't just automatically be able to do every kind of code. So sometimes labels can be like a really useful part of the picture, but you have to be careful because they're not the whole picture. Neon Tribe does a lot of prototyping in paper, which sort of democratizes the process of like designing something, and you can get everyone involved, whether they're an artist or whether they're a coder or whatever. And the other thing that it does is it means that you don't have to get it right the first time. And I think Elm has that too. You can take a trainee who's never coded before and you can be totally confident to just let them loose. And you hardly have to explain anything. You can just let them play around and they'll figure it out. It's got, as we know, a really supportive compiler, and I won't go into details about that, but Emma Cunningham did a really nice talk in Europe this year about how that compiler mitigates the fear of failure and makes us all more equal. And Jono Malenik did a talk also in Europe this year, and I'm sorry, I don't think the videos are available online. I'm not sure if they will be. But he's a visual designer, and he was talking about how amazing Elm was for using the data model to communicate with like members across the team as like a common interface of language so that the developers could speak with the designers and they both understood what the model was. And basically like much of the engineering constraints is taken care of by the constraints of Elm. So we can like use it in this like really cool way for like simpletons to be able to manipulate stuff. So my daughter likes to remind me that I'm not a robot. But from the list that I made when I was a kid, I'm not so sure. But there are certainly times like when I was talking to Holly and I was saying things like, oh, that's just a function and that's a type and you can use them in the view like this. And then I had to pause and say, you're not following me at all, are you? And she was like, nope. And it's really important to acknowledge that because often people won't say it. They won't admit it. They just get a sort of slowly more and more blank look on their face. And so if you say that it's okay and you talk to them about it, that's better than them going away not understanding anything you said. We need to remember that we're humans, we're not robots. And we need to remember that both when we speak to each other and also when we're writing the code. Because our efficiency needs are different to theirs, and that is like to I mean different to theirs as in like the people who are going to be the future readers and writers of your code base, but also different to the computer's needs. So when you're doing your like refactors and your reviews, you should focus on making it easier for everyone. And by that, I mean making it easier for the people who are going to be looking at your code and not worry about how clever the code is, because your computer can kind of handle it. So it is true, decisions are really hard. And I encouraged Holly to let her name start off however she thought of them and let them evolve naturally. So instead of saying to her, make a thing called this that does that, I just said, make a thing that does this. And I encouraged her to name stuff like without hesitating, which meant that I could know more about what she was thinking and how she understood, like how much she understood about what the code was actually doing. And besides, renaming stuff in Elm is really fun, it's not scary. So remember when I said it didn't matter that Holly had no development environment when she started? Well, that's not entirely true. And we had two kind of experiences that happened at the same time in our company. We had a Vue app that we were translating at the same time, or internationalizing at the same time as we were internationalizing the Elm app. And in that Vue app, someone left a curly brace off one of the JSON files, and it got reviewed, and it got merged in, and it got released to staging. And then one of our manual testers happened to be visiting that page in that language and saw a white screen. The same thing happened in Elm when Holly was just using her text editor and submitting code. It got reviewed, and it got merged in, and it got pushed, but it didn't get to staging because obviously it didn't compile. So I don't know about you, but I prefer the bottom one of these pictures because the other one could have made it into the actual production release. So I guess the point is that there will be bugs. There will always be bugs, but catching them at compile time is really great. So for all of us, not just people like Holly who are new to coding, it's important that when you come back to the code or when you pass it on, you're able to understand it. So if your code confuses another developer, no matter what their level of experience is, consider adding some comments about why you did it that way. Because you need to remember that we don't all have the knowledge of all the domains that we work in all the time. In Elm, it helps that someone can fix or implement a part without knowing the whole. And it also helps that there's no kind of behind-the-scenes magic. It's more predictable, and it encourages us to be deliberately verbose. The only magic with Elm is turning it into amazing JavaScript, but luckily that is not our problem. Well, most of us, that's not our problem. Elm makes people-friendly code, which is good for beginners, and it's good for teams, and it's good for like the future us, right? So when I was at Elm Europe, I was trying to explain to somebody who didn't already use Elm why I liked using Elm, because they asked, why do you like Elm? And I just said, because you like write some code and then it starts to make you happy. And they got really excited. They were like, oh, that's so nice. It starts to make you happy. And so I was like, okay, well, maybe if they think it's so exciting that it starts to make you happy, I'll use that in my talk. So I came back to England and I said to my colleague, oh, what do you think about this? I'm going to use it in my talk. It starts to make you happy. And he was like, yeah, it's kind of nice, but all like code starts to make you happy. That's why we do it. It doesn't matter what language you're using or what framework you're using. And I was like, oh, yeah. But Elm starts to make you happy sooner. So there's a lot less headbanging in theory before we can reach that happy point. And in my company, Holly isn't the only person who's feeling that joy right now. Those were all like first PR excitement things. Lots of people in my company like emojis a lot when they get excited. So before I get to the next bit, I'm pretty sure that everybody in this room has had the experience where they've gotten upset or made someone else upset or even cried or made someone else cry just as a result of how a project was going or how your team was communicating badly or otherwise. So I want to share some questions with you that I've been asking myself since I started this exploration of how we can work better in our teams. And I can't tell you what the answers are for you and your situation, but I think it's worth taking some time to think about them in the context of your teams and your projects. So how can we create spaces and cultures where we don't feel pressure to appear to be the best at everything all the time, or be the best at anything all the time? It doesn't matter. We're all trying to be our professional best, so we should give each other a break. People have different levels of confidence, and that confidence is usually arbitrarily determined. I don't know if you know what I mean, but Trump? And why do we try and intimidate each other? Why don't we just encourage everyone to speak their thoughts? I think like single track hierarchies are totally meaningless because we all have parallel skills and we're building a compilation, we're not building a tower. So I think we all want to be great at something and it shouldn't really matter what that something is. How can we improve the democracy of our collaborations? I think we could start with removing the dividing lines between those who get and those who do not. And that includes clients or product owners if your product is within your company. If you share your code with your clients, they light up. They appreciate you. Just go, oh, it's really simple. That you know the bit that does that thing on the screen, that's this bit of code. And they don't even need to understand it necessarily because they can see it and they can relate to something about it. And I've tried it with 2 clients now and they get really excited. They're like, oh, you're letting me see the magic part. And so everyone has skills and knowledge and experience to bring to the table. We should be encouraging people to try stuff and showing them how to do stuff, not pretending it's too hard for them. And we don't often put user needs of devs to the top priority in scoping. And I think if you do that thing of showing your clients the code, then they will give you more money to do things like tech debt. And the last one is, do labels and job roles prevent us from sharing knowledge openly? I think it's really easy to hurt each other's feelings. It's really easy to judge each other and judge each other's tech choices. And like, if everyone had to know everything to achieve success, it would be a total nonsense. Because, like, for example, you don't need to know chemistry or physics or biology, whatever it is you need to know to bake a cake. You don't need to know those things, but it might help you invent a new cake or a better cake. And that's really cool too, because we need those people who are inventing better cakes, right? We need engineers in our industry, but we don't all need to be those engineers in order to be productive or do our jobs. And so one of the things that I'm thinking about as well is, why does our community and the academic community as well seems to suffer the same thing? Why are people trying to hide their knowledge or like guard it or hide their lack of knowledge? I don't understand why we're not all just sharing everything like when people ask. So what can we do as a community? We all feel dumb and vulnerable sometimes. So the important thing, I think, is to not box people in and not judge them and not kind of jump to conclusions or make assumptions. Ignorance is a universal condition. Nobody, even people outside this room, nobody knows everything. So within this community at least, and I guess like by community I mean like planet Earth people, I'm pretty certain that we all mean well. So let's listen to anyone who finds themselves next to us in this space, no matter what their journey was to get here, or no matter what it is they're wanting to say. And that's all I got.